Welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, did the social media stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Obviously, before we start, any comments I make during today's episode of the show are wholly my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me. Right, okay, so this week, in all the years I've been doing this now, I realised I'd never actually done an episode of the show on Aberfeldy, so I thought, about time to put that right. And not only am I obviously looking at Aberfeldy, I'm also looking at I'm killing two birds with one stone, because we're looking at, or hopefully looking at, the whole business of batch variation. Now, as you can see, I have, or from the title page, you can see there are two distillery bottlings of the 21-year-old. And as you can see, I don't know whether you can really see, but there is a distinct colour difference between the one on the right and the one on the left, and hopefully we'll be talking about sort of the possible batch variation between those two. Now, incidentally, one of those bottlings came from the 2014 World Whisky Awards. That's this one, and this one was from a year later, from the World Whisky Awards of 2015. Now, I don't know what the batch numbers, if there are any or were any, on the bottles, because obviously I just received the sample, so I couldn't tell you that, but one would imagine there's obviously a difference. Well, we'll see if there's a difference between the two. Now, Aberfeldy is for me, has always been a lovely whisky, and sort of fairly overlooked, I think. And it was founded in 1896, a company owned by Dewar, and was one of the distilleries that was built by the well-known architect Charles Doig, him of the Japanese fetish, shall we say. And as you probably know, all of Doig's distilleries tended to have this pagoda roof above the kiln, and which is what kind of, I suppose, set them apart at the time. And the distillery itself kind of is a fully signed up member of the Goodrum First Law of Whisky, which, if you didn't know what that was, basically is pretty distillery equals pretty whisky. I mean, I know there are some exceptions to the rule, but by and large, in my experience, it's often the case of that, you know, these picturesque little distilleries tend to produce a lovely picturesque whisky, I guess, for want of a better term. And the distillery itself has a relatively long fermentation time of 65 to 85 hours, so they're setting out their stall to produce a fruity whisky, and it's slow distillation, tight-necked onion-shaped stills, and those give a little bit of obvious reflux, which adds to the honeyed characteristics of the malt when it starts to develop some age to it. Now, like I said, we're looking at this whole idea of batch variation, which in my opinion is not a bad thing. I mean, there's pros and cons, I suppose. The fact is that when you have different batches of the same age statement, you're never quite sure what you're going to get. You buy one batch, you really like it, you buy the second batch, which is not quite the same, and maybe you're a little bit disappointed. Obviously, some distilleries, or owners, tend to go down the caramel route, shall we say, to basically sort of try and even out. But at the end of the day, we know whisky is a living, breathing product. It's not a case of A plus B equals C. It's often a case of A plus B equals Y. You know, whisky kind of like essentially matures as it wants to mature. I mean, obviously, yes, you know that certain warehouses, certain temperatures tend to sort of like, will create a sort of a similar end product. But again, as we well know, these things are not linear. Whiskey does have a tendency to do odd things, things that during its sort of like maturation period, and they tend to come out slightly differently. Now, obviously, so the use of caramel is obviously one way of creating a uniform colour, but of course, as we well know, it tends to hamper the quality and the flavour of the actual spirit itself, in my personal opinion. And certainly up until about, I think it was about 2014, when Aberfeldy had a big sort of rebrand, the 12-year-old, which was obviously their kind of flagship bottling, I suppose, prior to that, and in my tastings, had been hamstrung by the use of caramel. Post that, they seem to have dropped the caramel. They never seem to use it in the 21, hence why we're looking at the whole batch variation theme. But certainly in the 12-year-old, from my personal tastings, they had indeed used caramel prior to 2014, which was a shame, I think. I mean, like I said, I've always been a really big fan of Aberfeldy. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous whiskey, and hopefully will, well, today's tasting will kind of show that. Now, obviously, being owned by Dewars, the bulk of the spirit will be earmarked for their blends, and I've not seen an independent bottling of Aberfeldy now in a long time, and the independent bottlings I've got in front of me are quite old, and like I said, I've not seen it in a long time, so it's a bit of a shame, but you know, that's the nature of the beast these days, isn't it? So anyway, let's just take a look at today's lineup then, shall we? Okay, so we're going to kick off with two single cask bottlings that were bottled by AD Rattray, or Dewar Rattray as they were called at the time. The first one is a 15-year-old. It was distilled in 1994, bottled in 2009. So yeah, that's going back a bit, isn't it? Bourbon cask number 4007 and bottled at 57.3%. Bottling number 2, again by Dewar Rattray. This time is still a 15-year-old, but this was distilled in 1998, bottled in 2013. Again, a single bourbon cask, 2405, and was bottled at the not inconsiderable ABV of 60.3 at 15 years old. Whew. Number 3 is a bottling by then, as they were called, Douglas Laing, in their Old Malt cask range. Obviously now the Old Malt cask range is obviously bottled by Hunter Lang, but back then it wasn't. So this is an 18-year-old. It was distilled in June of 1994, bottled in July of 2012, a refill bourbon hoggy, and the code number was DL8264. The next bottling we'll be looking at is a Connoisseurs Choice bottling, which was the old range, the Gordon MacPhail range. This was a 1990 distillation, June 1990, bottled in October of 2010, refill sherry, and it was 20 years old, bottled at 43%. And the funny thing is that in the Connoisseurs Choice range, this was pretty much my go-to bottling from that range. It was just always consistently good, and from memory there was about 3 or 4 bottlings. I think the other one was the Glen Elgin they used to do, the Brackler, and the Kalila. I think they were basically pretty much, you know, year after year, pretty much really consistent in their quality. A lot of the other bottlings, kind of came and went sort of quality wise, I think, but those 3 or 4 were certainly ones that I would have no problem with stocking. Oh no, I shouldn't say that because I'm talking about the company I like. Anyway, just ignore that I said that. Then we'll be, like I said, we'll be finishing off with hopefully looking at the concept of batch variation, and so the 2 bottlings of Aberfeldy 21, bottled at 40%. This particular, so refill bourbon and refill sherry butts, I believe. So this one was, I'm guessing, bottled sometime 2012, 2013, because I tasted it in December of 2013 for the 2014 World Whisky Awards. Yeah, and obviously the other bottling was tasted in December of 2014 for the 2015 World Whisky Awards. So, like I said, we'll see whether there's any batch variation between the 2. Hopefully there will be, otherwise I'll be looking like a complete idiot now, won't I? Anyway, Let's make a start with the first of the two AD Rattray bottlings then.
How can I believe the word you say? How can I?
Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? It's a lovely natural nose. It's earthy, dunnagey, but it has this lovely chocolate laden orange fruit, a little bit of spice, lovely almost kind of liquid honey. I mean, that is a sensational nose, and I'm quite surprised that the sample has actually lived this long, and it just goes to show that sometimes the samples do kind of live. I mean, I've picked samples out of my various boxes that have kind of like, you know, reduced to pretty much a sludge in the bottom, but sometimes, you know, they do surprise you. And this kind of says, it doesn't, it's kind of like the more natural end of Aberfeldy. I've always found Aberfeldy to be this gorgeous, fruity, honeyed whiskey, and this just adds that sort of slight, like I say, slight dunnagey notes, like natural kind of character. A little bit of brown sugar possibly. I mean, that is, or was, should we say, a pretty damn good nose. So we'll pass on. Chewy, malty, honeyed, again broad, fruity, orange, citrus. Again, it has that lovely kind of dunnagey, earthy, spicy note coming through. Lovely spicy note on the finish. It's a little bit of minerality. The alcohol is noticeable, but not sort of overwhelming. It's really emphasising those spices on the aftertaste. And all told, that is a beautiful whiskey. It really is absolutely fabulous. Let's put a little drop of water, as I've managed to keep a little drop, just to see what happens with that. And often with these really fruity whiskies, once the alcohol is just knocked down a little bit, they become luscious. You know, you could argue that maybe a little confected, but it has that beautiful caster sugar sort of coated characteristic to the fruit. I mean, that is lovely. It's certainly bringing out the vanilla, the bourbon oak character, but again, it's holding together absolutely gorgeously. Let's see what parts like that. Slightly sweeter, a little less spice note now. Obviously the alcohol, like I said, was emphasising the wood spices, but it's gorgeously fruity, it's long, it's juicy, and that was a stunning whiskey.
What if I don't want to belong to you?
Right, okay, so let's move on to the second Dewar Rattray bottling. So this is the 1988 distilled single cask. Let's see what nose gives us on this then, shall we? Now this is quite different. Well, yeah, it is quite different. It's more citric, that sort of slightly higher toned citric rather than the luscious orange. It's quite grassy, almost kind of spaying character. And here we go. This is just an ideal showing of how different the casks have obviously matured. Not quite as rich, not quite as luscious, but it still has that juicy, it's got dried, slightly dried fruit. It's got an almost kind of refill sherry kind of note happening, although it is just a single bourbon cask. But that's the oxidation that's making the sort of the fruit character a little bit more dried in character. Quite minerally as well. So you've got this grassy, minerally, almost spay kind of character happening, all set against this juicy fruit, American oak, and a bit of oxidation. That again, and it's 60-odd%, and it really doesn't smell like it. It is fabulously contained. The alcohol is fabulously contained, I should say. maybe not quite so juicy on the palate. The alcohol is emphasising the woodiness on the mid palate, and it's kind of masking the finish. So it's kind of a little bit tight, a little bit compact, but again you get the feeling that there is some lovely juicy fruit there. It's again got that sort of natural earthy, slightly dunnagey note, certainly on the aftertaste. So let's put a little drop of water with it and see if just knocking down the alcohol kind of releases the juiciness of the malt. Let's see. Ooh, yeah, no, that's really quite aromatic, almost perfumed, moist, succulent. Again, the orange note is coming out and is really juicy. I remember reading, was it, Johnson used to basically say that Strathmill was the orange muscat of the whisky world, but I can tell you what, Aberfeldy kind of gives it a run for its money in the orangey stakes, I should say. Again, it's still got that sort of slightly spayy, grassy, citric, fresh note running through it, and that is just, again, a beautiful nose. Let's see what the pump's like now. Fuller, more honey, more juicy citrus fruit. Again, that orange note is definitely noticeable. Bit perfumed, a bit kind of tart's handbag on the finish, it has to be said. That's a technical term. But still lovely and juicy. A little bit of spice, a little bit of earth, a little bit of dunnage. I mean, fabulous, absolutely stunning cask. And have AD Rattray still got some fabulous casks of Aberfeldy? Who knows? They certainly haven't released any for a long time as far as I can tell. But oh, beautiful. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 18-year-old old malt cask bottling. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Kind of sits somewhere between the other two. It's got that quite sort of grassy, minerally character that I found in the second of the two AD Rattray bottlings, but it's got that sort of dense honey underneath it, that richness of fruit. Again, slightly orangey, a little bit buttery, little herbal note as well now, sort of, you know, kind of almost fennel, I guess. I mean, just another beautiful whisky. Not quite so sort of aromatic, but it has a lovely kind of, a lovely vibrancy. Let's see what the pal's like. Oh, that finish is gorgeous. It's rich and juicy and luscious. Not quite so perfumed as the second bottling for the AD Rattray two casks, but still got that lovely orangey fruit. It's juicy. Not a huge amount of spice in actual fact. Again, veering slightly more towards the grassier end, the citric end of the spectrum. A little bit of straw, some lovely maturity, but not too much maturity. It's just beautifully balanced, beautifully weighted, lovely length. I mean, just stunning. Okay, so let's move on to the Connoisseurs Choice 20-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Musky orange, dusty, sawdusty oak notes, touch of dried fruit, a little bit of lavender possibly, a little bit of citrus conserve, again orange, not quite so sort of earthy or dunnagey as that certainly the first AD Rattray bottling, but gorgeously honeyed. I mean, again, beautifully balanced. You've got that kind of citrus, you've got the honey, you've got the barley, and it really doesn't feel like it's 20 years old. It has this lovely freshness to it. But given time in the glass, it does start to fill out, the oils start to appear, and like I said, it becomes beautifully juicy. See what that's like. Beautifully balanced, richer on the palate, more malty, again juicy, honey, a little bit of wood notes sort of creeping in on the mid to the end of the palate. Still really unctuous, gorgeously balanced, really long. I remember I've tasted a number of the Connoisseurs Choice Aberfeldy bottlings, and of all of the bottlings, this was the one that I thought was arguably the best bottling of Aberfeldy they produced. But you know, that's not detracting from the other bottlings that they did. Refill sherry, so it adds a little bit of dried fruit, but again it's not overwhelming, it's delicate, it's elegant, and it doesn't overshadow the distillery character. And well, you know, at the end of the day you can't ask for much more than that. Right, okay, so let's see if there is indeed some batch variation happening between these two. Let's tackle the first of the distillery bottle 21-year-olds. That's a gorgeous nose, majestic, mature, lovely dusty oak, floral honey, beeswax, dusty spice, a little bit of sherried dried fruit, but the emphasis is definitely on the mature American oak, almost tropical. So you know, we're kind of in the broader, less citric, spey kind of end of the sort of Aberfeldy kind of style. And it's obvious to me that the additional sort of length of maturation has seemed to sort of emphasise the sort of like the richness of and the honeyed notes. A little bit of white fruit, a little bit of granitiness, a little bit of citrus. I mean, that's just a stunning nose, absolutely gorgeous. So pass on. Soft, mature, oh, it's a majestic malt, it really is. Oodles of honey, orange blossom honey, thick set honey, lightly tropical fruit, mature American oak, a little bit of dried sherried fruit, a little bit of spice. Oh, that's stunning. I mean, that is really stunning. I mean, I don't know what the current retail price of the 21-year-old is. It's not going to be cheap because it's a 21-year-old, but damn, that's stunning. I mean, that is really, really beautiful. It's just one of those sort of whiskies that you could just sort of like, you know, you take a sip of and it is just majestic, and you just sort of go, oh, that's gorgeous, and it's damn gorgeous. Okay, so on to the final 21-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Possibly a little bit more intensity, more sherried notes, more dried fruit. It's got a sort of almost incensey kind of spiciness, that sort of soft, almost smoky incense note. Again, tropical fruit, mature tropical fruit, a little bit of mature American oak, a little bit of spice. Not quite as luscious and honey as gorgeous as the previous bottling, but still, it's not a bad nose. But it's very different, and I think there's just obviously been a little, certainly judging from the colour, a little bit more sherry used in this particular batch, and I wouldn't say it's detrimental to it. It's just very different, and this is the whole thing about sort of batch variations. You know, it's on the one hand, you applaud the fact that they're not trying to sort of like, you know, make it exactly the same by basically, you know, smothering it in caramel. But on the other hand, you're going, well, it's not quite the same as the previous release of 21-year-old. And this was just a year apart, these two samples. So, anyway, like I said, it's got maybe a little bit more vibrancy possibly. Of course, the big kind of elephant in the room with regards to this is obviously 40%. So obviously chill filtration has been used, which is a shame. I keep going on about, and the trouble is that sort of like the whiskey industry is a bit like a bloody dinosaur at the end of the day. It's because we've done this all the time. I mean, you know, you could bottle this at 46%. I don't think it would be to the detriment of the whiskey. It would add a few quid to the price, but when you're talking, you know, several hundred quid, well, probably 150, 170, well, what's an extra 5 quid on a 21-year-old? And really, you know, this is what the whiskey industry should be doing, you know, in my personal opinion. But still, I mean, you can't argue this is still a lovely whiskey. Let's see what the nose gives us. Not quite so gorgeous, it has to be said. I mean, it's still a lovely whiskey. There's a few wrinkles, shall we say. I mean, well, you know, I've got some as well, you know. There's a little bit of Marno just cropping up there. There's a little bit of cardboard as well. The spices just feel slightly cardboardy. It's a bit underpowered. It really doesn't have the presence of the previous bottling. It's got some honey, it's got some lovely fruit, it's got a little bit of dried fruit, probably a little bit more on the sherry cask, but there's some wrinkles happening there. It's not as luscious, it's not as exuberant, it's not as it just doesn't make me go, it makes me go, God. And here we have an innate problem with, you know, aging whiskey that sometimes they just will not sort of go quite as you want them. Yes, you can vat them together and hope that some of the sort of slightly lesser quality casks will get lost in the mix, but the reality is they don't at the end of the day. They kind of mar a great product, and you know, certainly from tasting the first bottle of the 21-year-old, that was stunning. That was just how I envisaged Aberfeldy. The second bottling is not how I envisaged it. And it's, like I say, it just goes to sort of, you know, emphasise the whole idea of, you know, or the whole thing about batch variation is that sort of sometimes you will get great batches, sometimes you'll get less than great batches. Still a lovely whiskey, it has to be said, but like I said, a few wrinkles. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, I think this has been a really fascinating tasting. I still think that overall, you know, Aberfeldy is a remarkably good whiskey. It's certainly a B+ whiskey distillery in my own personal opinion, and it's a shame that you just don't see very much of it these days in the independents, because, you know, the AD Rattray 94 15-year-old was just stunning, absolutely gorgeous, a beautiful cask. You know, it had that natural character, it had that rich, luscious distillery character with a little bit of earth and a little bit of dunnage. It was just absolutely sublime. And the second bottling wasn't bad either. I mean, it was, like I said, showing the sort of slightly more kind of spey kind of character, that slightly more grassy, citric kind of side to the Aberfeldy character, which was interesting. But again, it had all the sort of like the good hallmarks of the distillery, and the Old Malt cask bottling, well, like I said, kind of sat somewhere between the two AD Rattray casks, in that it displayed some of the luscious honeyed notes and some of the kind of more spey kind of citric grassiness. But again, an absolutely beautiful bottling. And the MacPhails, again, probably more towards the sort of the lusher end, the richer honeyed kind of end of the Aberfeldy spectrum, but again, you know, a stunning whiskey nonetheless. Yeah, that was absolutely gorgeous. Excuse me. The first of the distillery bottled 21s, which was stunning, a whiskey to absolutely die for, it has to be said. It had everything that I love in a whiskey going on: luscious, juicy, American oak to the fore, a little bit of balancing sherry. And it was interesting because there was a viewer, you know, said, oh, you're not very much of a fan of sherry. And, you know, I don't dislike sherry, and I keep saying this all the time, but I don't want it to blanket everything. You know, fat in some sherry cask, matured spirit into your American oak, get the balance, you know, get a little bit of dried fruit and that kind of thing, because the sherry matured spirit does add, you know, some lovely elements. But when that's all you can taste, when all you can stick your nose in the glass and smell is kind of Oloroso, it's kind of like, well, it's really disappointing, because I could be drinking any whiskey from anywhere, you know. But obviously that particular bottling just displayed absolute textbook use of American oak casks and sherry casks, and was absolutely divine. And although the final bottling of the 21 was not a bad whiskey, there was a few cracks, shall we say. There was a few wrinkles. There was some less than perfect spirit in there, which was a bit of a shame. But it just, like I said, it kind of highlights the whole batch variation thing. And yeah, and like I said, in some instances it's something to be applauded by the fact that they're prepared to sort of do that. Maybe an idea would be to use batch numbers or something like that, just to basically, you know, make a difference between them, rather than just going, it's another bottling of the 21-year-old. I've always been a big fan of the use of batch numbers, because then it basically, not necessarily covers you, but it basically, you know, it says, well, look, it is a different batch. There may well be some variation. And in this case, the variation probably wasn't that great. You know, there were some less than perfect casks crept in there, shall we say. But I think that's it. You know, nowadays we want more transparency. We want, as consumers, that's what we want. We want to know the ins and outs. And really, I think that the whiskey industry, as a, you know, is still, you know, a bit of a bloody dinosaur, that it's taking its time to catch up. A lot of the new distilleries that are coming out are obviously sort of taking that, I wouldn't say criticism, but that comments on board, and using batch numbers, codes, all that kind of sort of stuff, so you know. I mean, yeah, some of the older distilleries do exactly the same. I mean, the amount of times I've had people phone up about things like, say, the Glendronach 21 or the 18 probably more than the 21, asking what's the code on the bottle. I'm after a specific sort of bottling from of that 18-year-old from a specific year, because that really floated my boat. Well, they probably didn't say that, but that's the inference, shall we say. And oh no, I don't want that one. I wanted, you know, and so it kind of gives, it's all about giving the consumer as much information, as much information that they need to make an informed choice of whether they want to buy that particular bottling or not. And you know, transparency, I'm kind of all for it. So anyway, we're kind of obviously getting to that time of year where I have to kind of work weekends, although I'm not actually doing too many this year, which is kind of quite nice. But there'll obviously be the odd week where I'm not able to do an episode of the show, but I will certainly try and fit in as many as humanely possible. And I don't quite know what I'm going to do for the Christmas episode of the show. We'll have to have a good rummage to see what I can find. But anyway, until then, all that's left to say is good afternoon and good ramming.